Greetings Morrowind fans, and welcome to the Arkanthan Archive. Full disclosure, before we get into the Kwama meat of the video, I'm going to be geeking out pretty hard about Morrowind for the duration, and if what you're looking for is a highbrow analysis of its many flaws, then I'm afraid you're not going to find that here. I'm simply cataloguing my own personal experience with this game, and on the off chance that it resonates with you and your experience, then that's great. My aim here is not to convince anyone to change their mind about this game per se, or to convince them to play it full stop. In a crowded field of Bethesda content creators here on YouTube, I just really want to talk about the game and explain how and why I came to love it. Until quite recently, I'd never really been one for swords, shields and spells, apart from a semi-regular playthrough of Ocarina of Time that I've upheld pretty religiously since the age of about 11 or 12. I've always been firmly rooted in the grotesque offerings of first-person shooters and sci-fi gorefests. I suppose that I never considered that mythical beasts, magic spells and hallucinatory landscapes of giant mushrooms and floating jellyfish could be anywhere near as exciting as turning aliens into red goo with dual-wield shotguns. And that's the thing I've found about evolving tastes. You know, I still like all that stuff, but now I like this stuff too. Back in the day, I was quite content with my first-person shooters, and I was never really that fussed about playing fantasy or RPG games. It's just not my preferred genre. I actually started properly gaming on PC around the time of Morrowind's release back in 2002, with games like Deus Ex, Dark Forces 2, Jedi Outcast and Red Faction in constant rotation. Even though I had a great time with these games, there was still an arbitrary obstacle to contemporary gaming that I wasn't able to overcome. System requirements. My family owned a generic Dell PC, which was what me and my younger brother would use for gaming, but it simply wasn't powerful enough to handle certain games. I had my first taste of the limitations of PC gaming when I tried to boot up Knights of the Old Republic, and the family computer just couldn't hack it. I do have these vague memories of agonisingly long loading screen times and playing games at what I can only assume were single-digit frame rates, but persevering all the same just for the sheer love of it. Little kids don't tend to have a couple of £100 lying around to fork out for new PC components, so if me and my brother had bought a game that wouldn't run on this machine, we didn't have much choice but to admit defeat and return it. Yeah, sad times. My family would tolerate interactive entertainment to an extent, but we weren't allowed any of the latest consoles. I never owned them at the height of their popularity, so I had to take what I could get. In 2020, I made the decision to buy myself a laptop. To my detriment, I am somewhat of an overly cautious consumer, and I managed to talk myself out of buying a powerful machine. My reasoning was that I didn't want to spend too much, and I didn't think that I'd need a supercharged RGB powerhouse PC to play a handful of the old classics. And I was technically correct, which is the best kind of correct, but it wasn't long before I realised that anything released after the mid-2000s was basically out of the question. Thwarted by my frugality and short-sightedness, with my potato laptop in hand and a pandemic keeping me indoors, I was free to roam my janky, pixelated playground. Although this was a teachable moment, the lesson here being don't cheap out on tech because you'll regret it, being forced to make the best of what I had meant that I ended up playing and genuinely enjoying some fantastic early shooters. I became obsessed with 90s FPS titles like Doom, Quake, Half-Life and Blood. There's an enduring charm to these games that for a brief moment can make you forget that what you're looking at is drab and ugly, harsh on the eyes and harsh on the ears. I had a lot of fun with that laptop because I was forced to find the fun for myself. I didn't have the luxury of downloading something on Steam confident that it would run without fault on my deluxe custom-built beast. But I wasn't going to get fooled again, so a year later I upgraded to a Dell G7, which opened me up to more modern titles and, crucially, the world of modding. I dabbled previously in Bethesda's back catalogue with Fallout 3, and it took me a little while to acclimatise to the idea that there was more than one way of playing a video game. My comfort zone of linearity and progressing through a campaign to a predetermined outcome was being challenged with a seemingly vast open world, different ways to approach certain situations, and I was hooked. Almost 10 years after its release, I picked up Skyrim on a Steam sale, and just like that I was thoroughly converted from a die-hard shooter aficionado to a fully fledged fantasy fan. And this was all during COVID too, so I had a great excuse to sink a couple of hundred hours into an open world RPG, unconstrained by petty distractions such as going outside and going to work. The actual gameplay of Skyrim aside, which I do find to be quite good, and overall I think it lends itself well to an accessible AAA gaming experience, it was the very tangible, peaceful atmosphere of the game that really drew me in. Jeremy Saul's iconic soundtrack with its dreamlike, ethereal ambience, its moody, cavernous dungeon themes, as well as its chest-thumping battle anthems, will always stand out to me as one of the things that cemented my love for the series. The surging strings of The City Gates evoke a feeling of mournful serenity, something that you feel when you detect a drop in temperature as winter draws nearer, and being able to evoke something so tangible and human by the music alone is something that I really admire. During dialogue exchanges with Dark Elves in Skyrim, you often hear these whispers about Morrowind, the homeland of the Dunmer people, a mysterious and chaotic volcanic mushroom kingdom. Speaking with the Dunmer folk of the Grey Quarter, a squalid slum located in the city of Windhelm, it's almost pitiful to hear how they've been forced to flee from a catastrophic natural disaster to the relative safety of Skyrim, only to languish in poverty. They find themselves at the sharp end of the same mistrust, disdain and intolerance from Windhelm's Nords that they had once shown to the Enoirs and Outlanders in Morrowind. The Dark Elves have been relegated down the social ladder, and perhaps in the eyes of some, on an even footing with the Argonians and Khajiit, the beast races that they themselves oppressed, because they viewed them as inferior. It's an ironic twist of fate. An ancient society and culture predicated on long-standing traditions of xenophobia, ethno-nationalism, slavery and isolationism, all burned to a cinder. Nevertheless, a pocket of Dunmeri society lingers to the northwest of Vvardenfell in Solstheim, and it's here that my intrigue for the alien world of Morrowind was piqued. Even though the iteration of Solstheim in Skyrim's Dragonborn DLC is just a limited snapshot of the world of Morrowind, it gives the player the opportunity to set sail on a mysterious and quite a dark adventure. The setting itself being this barren, ashen, unfriendly, hostile environment, complete with the signature crustaceous architecture of House Redoran and the imposing mushroom tower of the Telvanni wizard Neloth, is a very cool deviation from Skyrim's more comforting, resplendent landscape. After my character in Skyrim had taken an extensive holiday on the island of Solstheim, unravelling the mystery of the dragon priest Mirak and the Daedric prince Hermaeus Mora, I decided that it was time for me to venture back into the past and uncover the origin of the incredibly odd but interesting world of Morrowind. The first thing that I was struck by when I disembarked from the ship that had brought me, a nameless prisoner, to Vvardenfell was the noticeable juxtaposition between the Imperials and the Dark Elves. The Imperials, with their Roman armour and medieval European structures, invoke a feeling of grounded familiarity, and the Dark Elves, with their ornate robes and ginormous howling insect buses, invoke quite the opposite. The Siltstrider parked up at Seydanine is one of the first things you properly see once you open the hatch to the deck of the ship, and is quite a bold visual statement. You've arrived on this island being ushered off of the prison barge and onto the docks, greeted by a man that looks like a Roman soldier, and just off to the right in your peripheral vision is this enormous bloody insect creature making whale noises. Like, it's just so delightfully bizarre in the best possible way. It's such a cool moment because it kind of feels like the game is telling you to expect the unexpected, and it just gets weirder from here if anything. In sharp contrast to Skyrim's Nordic culture, which draws from real-world Scandinavian history and mythology, the world of Morrowind and the Dark Elves is less clear-cut and feels a lot harder to define. It's like a diverse celebration of a myriad of real-world cultures. It's a mishmash of Middle Eastern, African, Asian, Islamic, Hindu, Egyptian, Japanese, Mongolian, accented with references to contemporary pop culture franchises. There are undeniable echoes of Star Wars and Dune. However, although it's obvious that these real-world inspirations are what drove some of the creative direction in the game's development, the culture and setting of Morrowind still feels totally unique, and that's what makes it so special. It really is a rich and fascinating world, and I'm always a bit disheartened when people dismiss it because of its dated gameplay and graphics, because they're missing out on what I would consider to be an astonishing feat of creativity. Now, I'm going to be totally honest here and say that the character creation in Morrowind was very intimidating for me as a first-time player, and it took me about 6 attempts and a fair few beginner's tips and tricks videos before I could comfortably proceed with the game. I would tentatively describe the playstyle that I eventually settled on as a sort of brute burglar. Heavy armour and weapons to dispatch my foes, but with a little dash of stealth and security just so I could take people's stuff. I wanted to be able to wield the best weapons and smash my enemies to smithereens, but I didn't want to be excluded from the abilities that require a bit more finesse. Most importantly, I just wanted to play the game and explore the main quest, and that can be a bit difficult if you're getting completely wrecked by the cave dwellers in Seyda-Neen. And that's when I realised that this is a game that doesn't reward a clumsily constructed build in its early stages. After all, this game is from a time when you would have gone out to a video game store and bought a physical copy, you would have studied the manual back to front, or even used a strategy guide, and that's just not the way gaming is anymore. You know, yes, this game does have some fairly complex and convoluted systems underneath the hood, but I don't think that should exclude anyone from playing it. Quite the opposite, I think the game is fun and engaging because of those things rather than despite them. You do need to think carefully about what race would fit your playstyle and major and minor skills and which star sign can give you the most helpful buffs. And there's something about this which really fires up your brain in a very pleasant way. Once your hits start landing and your spells start casting and your arrows begin hitting your targets, your alchemy, enchanting, blacksmithing and lockpicking are succeeding, there's almost a little voice in the back of your head that's saying, now this is pod racing. But seriously, I can totally get why people would be turned off of this game in the first instance. They go in blind, they hastily slap together a build and head out to the nearby swamps of the Bitter Coast to go and kill a mud crab with the dagger they found on the table in the census office, only for this to happen. Aside from the restrictions that a dud build can have on your experience of the early game, there's the more obvious problem of movement speed. The slow movement speed. If you've decided that you want to play as a barbarian hoarder like I did, major in heavy armour and heavy weapons while looting everything in sight, the early game running speed feels quite a bit like when you're trying to run in a dream. So slow. But this segues into where the fun of a lot of Bethesda's games comes from, and where Morrowind shines in particular. The mods, dude. Are you finding yourself exasperated that none of your hits are connecting and your sword is inexplicably just clipping through your enemies? You can mod that. Is your character weighed down by all of the items that you've heartlessly pilfered from the hovels of unsuspecting citizens, and your running speed is akin to that of a sloth on benzos? You can just mod it. Are the rough and washed out textures of vanilla Morrowind so acidic to your eyes that it makes you wish you were looking at something just a little nicer? Well, guess what? You can mod it. The Morrowind modding community is absolutely incredible, and even with a few very basic mods you can make the game prettier, bigger and arguably more playable. The Tamriel Rebuilt Landmass mod, which seeks to realise the original vision of the developers by delivering the entire mainland of Morrowind, has been in the works for years now, and I can't overstate the sheer scale and enormity of this project. It gives the player the option to experience even more of what the base game unfortunately wasn't able to achieve, and I often find myself sprinting and leaping around the mainland admiring the scenery and exploring to my heart's content. Morrowind has offered me a very unique escapism, and with the constantly expanding modding capabilities, it's a game that I find almost impossible to completely tear myself away from. In much the same way that people enjoy the replayability of Skyrim, Oblivion and the Fallout series as well, I will always seek to recapture the feeling that I first had when I started playing it for the first time, by starting a new character and doing it all over again. But this time maybe I'll be a destruction mage, or perhaps a slick-talking persuasionist with an aptitude for mercantile manipulation. Not wishing to state the obvious, quite apart from anything, Morrowind is just so nerdy, and I mean that in the best possible way. I'd almost go so far as to say that it's nerdier than Star Wars or Lord of the Rings, because those franchises are easily beloved by anyone, whereas Morrowind does crank up the nerdometer quite considerably. Morrowind is to a contemporary fantasy fiction like Lord of the Rings, like Star Trek is to Star Wars. You know, even little kids like Star Wars, but Star Trek has got acne, if you know what I'm saying, respectfully. It has this undeniable Y2K charm about it, and that was my defining era of gaming. The ugly textures and the kind of graceless, clunky mechanics that make the game what it is, those are reasons why I enjoy playing it, because it's reminiscent of some of those games that I previously mentioned that I played when I was a kid. I'm 30 years old now, and anything that activates the nostalgia centre of my brain is something that I want to invest time in, if only to revel in the vibe of my youth for just that little bit longer before I have to confront the reality of my adult life. In a not dissimilar way to how I was captivated by the atmosphere of Skyrim, by the game's beautifully emotive soundtrack, I always feel a little shiver go up my spine when I hear Peaceful Waters. Exploring the stinky swamps, the rolling hills, volcanic mountains, lush forests, and the Tatooine-adjacent cities of Morrowind for the first time is an experience that will always stay with me for as long as I live. And I hope that I live for a good while longer, if only to have the privilege of enjoying this decidedly dated but wonderful game. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. I've been wanting to make it for a long time, and I really hope that you enjoyed it. I'd like to continue to create fun and engaging content in celebration of this game and its community. Please consider liking this video and hitting the subscribe button, and I'll see you next time.